It's not often that I finish reading a novel and I'm left so uncertain about how I feel about it, and you might think that this ambivalence might be an indication that there's some great artfulness in the writing, but I'm not so sure. It might just be a really messy book. So I've finished reading the Korean novel Whale by Cheon Myeong-Kwan, translated by Cheon Kim, and I'm really puzzling what to make of this carnivalesque, multi-generational tale. And the story is some kind of mashup between the novels 100 Years of Solitude and Orlando and Norwegian Wood and A Little Life. I wouldn't say that it's so influenced by Moby Dick, but I thought it would just be fun to wear the t-shirt today anyway. It's at once fantastical and also rooted in a very specific period of South Korean history. It places women at the center of the story, showing their resilience and their struggles in a male-dominated society, but it also sexually objectifies them. Its playful narrative voice is both charming and aggravating. It philosophically explores aspects of society and human nature, but it's also sometimes simplistic in its observations. It's about alienation, love, greed, loneliness, revenge, and large penises. So it's really difficult to know how to respond to this highly imaginative tale, which centers around Gwembok, a woman from humble origins whose business acumen leads her to achieve great success, and her mute daughter Chun-Hui, whose imposing body possesses supernatural strength. The picaresque story presents their lives in a series of episodes which loop back on themselves, with plenty of digressions and side characters who frequently reappear throughout the story, whether they are living or dead. And it's a wild adventure which is both wondrous and frustrating. There are many disturbing scenes of abuse, mutilation, and rape, and I want to emphasize that it's not the depiction of these actions which feels objectionable, but they're presented in a way which is almost cartoonish, in that there are few physical or psychological consequences. This is probably because the mode of storytelling is like a fairy tale, which isn't concerned with realistic repercussions. But then it's also a novel that's rooted in history, because it refers to the war between the North and the South, and the fight against communist sentiment, and the popularity of John Wayne movies. So it's confusing to know whether the narrator is taking these scenes of brutality seriously, or just using violence as a way to embellish the plot. The story also casts long, lingering, indulgent looks at the female body, including breasts, female genitalia, and large asses. This isn't simply reflecting the way they are objectified by male characters. These are often juvenile representations which serve no real purpose other than to titillate or repulse. Equally, when men are physically described, it usually focuses on characteristics like large, imposing muscles, or a pitiful lack of muscles, or a sexual organ so large that no woman could resist it. Later on in the novel, there's also a gender transformation, or an apparent transformation, and this could have been interesting, but it occurs at a point in the character's life when it's not so much about their inability to achieve success as a woman as it is about meeting a younger woman who is so desirable, and apparently the only way to be with her is to present as a man. Yes, it mentions how this character found it easier to no longer be sexually objectified as a woman, but really, she was progressing just fine on her own. Moreover, when this character switches gender, their personality also instantly changes from caring and empathetic to greedy and unkind. So rather than being a method of exploring nuance, it feels like it's merely reinforcing the gender binary. To be honest, as discomforting and off-putting as many of these things were, I could have tolerated them more if I didn't find the narration so irritating. The authorial voice guides us through this tale and frequently speaks to the reader in a casual and direct manner. At times, this is quite playful, but it often questions the validity of the story that's being told. There are wistful speculations on possible reasons for the characters' motivations and reasoning. A rhythm is built whereby the consequences of a scene are described as happening because, quote, this is the law of blank, whatever. Some examples are, this is the law of ideology, or this is the law of habit, or this is the law of gambling. This comes to feel more simplistic rather than profound or rueful. It also calls into question the truth of the story that is being presented. For instance, in one scene, a character drowns. The narrator questions whether this was a suicide as it is initially presented, but then it goes on to a scene in which it describes in detail how this suicide occurred. So what's the point of the narrator raising uncertainty or claiming that certain things are unknown? The story almost always shows and makes it very clear what actually happened and why. Yes, there are many things about history which can't be known because we have no tangible evidence. But if a story is presented in a way which is definitive and allows no room for ambiguity, then why are you questioning it? Especially as we're given no details about the identity of the authorial voice or that voice's motivations. It just comes across as very muddled. Now, despite all of these troubling aspects of this novel, there's a lot in this story which is surprising and fun. I'm not trying to contradict all of the points that I just made, but it's definitely an engaging tale in terms of spectacle. So I was often compelled to keep reading it just to see what was going to happen next. And it's also quite moving in the final sections of the book how the story comes together. This is especially true in the disconnection between mother and daughter. The mother's drive for autonomy leads her to emotionally distance herself from her imposing daughter while maintaining this sentimental attachment to a gigantic sea creature, which leads her to build this movie theater shaped like a whale. Equally, the daughter, who has suffered tremendous abuse because of her simple and straightforward relationship with the world, longs for an emotional connection which can only be found with the spirit of an elephant. I know that can sound quite ridiculous describing it from the outside, but I found it deeply poignant how, rather than forging honest human relationships, their feelings are projected onto these giant animals. So how do I ultimately feel about this novel? I'm still not really sure. I definitely felt frustrated by some aspects of it, even irritated. At other times, I was completely absorbed by the sheer bombastic nature of it. However, a lot of that I think does come down to spectacle, because certainly there is a lot of creativity and imagination, but is there a deeper meaning? Would I recommend it? Well, based upon the description and the multiple critical and positive reviews of it, I think a lot of readers will have made up their mind already whether this is a book for them or not. And this is also a novel that's been shortlisted for the International Booker Prize, and I found it really interesting considering the reading guide for Whale that's on the Booker Prize website. So I'll put a link to that in the description below. The judges give a compelling summary and assessment of the book, and I like how they call it a hymn to restlessness and self-transformation, but they also say it's a story of a woman making her way in a hostile world, and that is always relevant. This is a story full of magic and humor, but there's also profound darkness and struggle, terrible violence and prejudice. And I guess I would just say, I question how much this novel is actually assessing this prejudice that is occurring, or is it merely presenting it and kind of reaffirming some of these prejudices? And I honestly don't know the answer to that. I just think it's interesting to ask the question. I've also seen a lot of responses to this book which say, I don't know if I understood all of the symbolism that was involved, but I kind of wonder if does this symbolism have meaning, or do we just assume that it isn't symbolic or standing for something else? I also really enjoyed reading the interview with the author, who was quite surprised to be listed for this prize because he originally wrote and published this novel 20 years ago. So I would be really interested to know how he feels about it now, or would he write it in a way which is slightly different now? Because I wonder if some parts of this book have now been slightly dated, and so if he would change those things. Or maybe he wouldn't change anything. Maybe he would keep everything the same. And I don't think that books should be continuously revised just to keep up with the sensibility of our society. It's also really interesting reading the interview with the translator Cheon-Myeong-Kwan, because she read and translated this novel recently, and in the interview she says she actually didn't consult with the author at all about any aspects of it. She just translated it all herself, and also to gear herself up to translating this novel, she read 100 Years of Solitude, and so I can really see the influence of Marquez in this translation. But I'd also really be interested to ask her about her views of the aspects of the novel in which women are objectified. So there's still a lot to think about and consider concerning this novel, and I completely understand why some readers might decide not to read it at all, or have picked it up and decided it wasn't for them and so put it aside. But I know other readers who have been completely beguiled by it, so it's really interesting to see everyone's varied responses to this book. But I'd love to know how you feel in the comments below, whether you've read this book, whether you DNF'd it, or if you're interested in reading it now. Please let me know about that and we can have a discussion. But I hope you're doing well and reading good things, and I will speak to you again soon. Bye bye.